Hello there. I'm going to be talking here about some issues and questions related to our class on social inequality. I'm going to be going to screen share mode here to pull up our first PowerPoint, which is here. Okay. So we start off with basically a series of questions. I like to sort of format the class as like a puzzle or an investigation. And so we'll begin with like a lot of statistics and charts and graphs and things that sort of look at the landscape of social inequality as it currently exists. And then try to kind of, as the semester goes on, try to kind of figure out how it happened, why it happened. And also to think about like what we can do about it, what people can do, what people have done in the past, and what people are doing now to combat these social inequalities. So I start with basically a list of 10 questions here. And we're just going to look at the first two of them in this lecture. And then the rest of the questions will be in subsequent lectures. So first we have, what do we mean by social inequality and how do we measure it? And then secondly, how have the dynamics of social inequality changed over time? So the second one is more of a kind of a historical question. The first is more of a kind of definitional question, like how do we measure or calculate or define what we mean by social inequality. And the second one, in terms of it being how things have changed over time, is something that requires us to take a kind of longer view, a longer historical view. The third and fourth questions, what economic and political factors have caused social inequality to worsen, and how is social inequality in the US related to social inequality internationally? These are kind of related questions insofar as they get us into matters of globalization. Now, this class is intended to be just kind of focused more on the United States. And so we will be looking mostly at American society. But in order to understand American society, you do have to put it in this larger international global context. And so as per the fourth question, we will be looking at some kind of comparisons between the United States and other countries around the world. We will also consider like sort of how American policy has impacted other societies around the world, particularly like military and economic policy of the United States, and its sort of large empire of military domination and financial domination. And, these are also questions that this fourth question, kind of causes us to think about too, like how globalization has in turn impacted communities in the United States, especially cities in, like the Midwest and the Northeast, where there's been a lot of manufacturing job loss as a result of globalization. And, entire communities have been sort of gutted because some company picked up and left to go to Mexico or to some other country where the labor is cheaper. And so it's that kind of globalization and so-called free trade and free trade agreements have had a devastating impact on a lot of on many communities and cities throughout the country that are in kind of a palpable state of decline. So these questions of like economic and political factors and the relationship of international inequality are really related in insofar as these are kind of global processes that are going on that have caused social inequality to worsen in the United States. There are definitely also political factors that are kind of particular to the United States, especially the power of the right wing and the Republican Party in particular, and the Democratic Party also kind of going along with these policies that basically have enriched corporations and the wealthy and the business class at the expense of labor and the working class. That's been a sort of a political factor that has been kind of like where the right wing has, in the shape of the Republican Party, has been at the forefront of that, but they've also gotten a lot, of the so-called centrist or moderate Democrats to go along with them over the years. And then we look at the question of how does immigration policy impact social inequality? This is also, to some extent, a kind of an international question, a question of the global economy, and one that has a huge impact in terms of immigration policy, kind of eating into the rights of working class people and keeping wages low, and creating all kinds of means of disempowering working class people. For the sixth question, how are the social inequalities of class intersect with those of race and gender? This gets us into, these questions we would call intersectional questions, or questions of how these different systems of oppression and exploitation are interrelated with one another. So when we look at, the wealth gap or the pay gap, we'll see disparities of race and gender that, intersect with those of class. And certainly we'll have many readings, and many of the films that we will watch will look at these kind of intersecting, matrix of domination that includes class, race, and gender as kind of inseparable dynamics of oppression and exploitation. The seventh and eighth question you should notice have in common the word reproduce. So how is social inequality reproduced in institutions like the family, education, the economy, and the state? And then how is social inequality reproduced in systems of representation, like the media, language, and culture? So with reproduction, we're interested in, again, a kind of a historical process in which inequalities are reproduced from generation to generation. How, as I said in the first day of class, the vast majority of people in America will end up in the same social class that they were born into. Even though we like to think of this society as being one of equal opportunity, where people succeed or fail based on their merits and their effort, the statistical reality is actually that this is not the case. The statistical reality is that people generally end up in the same social class that they were raised in their family. So, the family becomes an important starting point, an important mechanism for considering these institutions and the various social processes by which inequality is reproduced over time across generations. The educational system is certainly a very important institution that plays a crucial role in reproducing these inequalities. The economy, the state, public policy, the criminal justice system, all of these factors come into play in explaining how, despite the sort of mythologies of the American dream, this is not the land of equal opportunity. This is a highly stratified society, in which people's opportunities for success have everything to do with the class and family and neighborhood and school that they go to, and all of these institutional factors that are outside of the control of individuals. When it comes to how social inequality is reproduced in systems of representation, we look at sort of like the symbolic media, the, television, films, advertising, these places in which, various stereotypes have been reproduced about people of color, about the working class, about women, about queer folks. All of these systems of representation have contributed to, a biased social perception of these different groups, which have made it seem like basically that they deserve their oppression. In one way or another. These are, systems of representation that have contributed to blaming the victim and stereotyping people into a view of the world that basically says that those who are on top deserve to be there, and those who are not on top similarly deserve to be where they are. So that system of representation that is embedded in the media and is reflected in our language and in our broader culture, that system of representation very much contributes to the reproduction of this unequal society that is very much stratified along these lines of class and race and gender and sexuality. The last two questions that we look at, are the ones that, like I said on the first day of class, we try not to get too, kind of gloom and doom about things, and we do try to, remember that there are these movements both historically and in the present that have resisted these forms of inequality and that have made, tangible, actual changes in the society. And so we will have, both a kind of a historical look at movements like, the labor movement, the movement, for unions and organized workers, in which, working class people did gain a bigger slice of the pie, and did get more job security and more benefits and more pay through their organizing. And we will look similarly at movements in the present that are achieving the same thing and that are doing that same kind of organizing work that in the past has translated to greater gains for working class people. So, that includes things like the Amazon labor union that won, has won some big victories in New York this last year. And it includes the Starbucks union, that there's been this wave of people organizing in Starbucks and being victorious in terms of getting union representation. And it also means that we look at movements, for racial justice, for climate justice, for gender equality. These movements have been absolutely instrumental in creating a more egalitarian society. And they very much intersect, again, with these movements that are rooted in the labor movement and among working class people. So, here within these movements, and the Amazon labor union and the Starbucks unions are really good examples of this. Class, race, and gender are really kind of inseparable, intertwined kinds of dynamics that are all at play. So, we'll be looking at different points in the semester, and you will have also like different readings and films, especially towards the end of the semester, that look at these social movements, these forms of organizing, these kind of grassroots movements that are looking to empower working class people through collective action and collective organizing. So it's very important that we don't get too dispirited or depressed or disempowered by looking at the things that have been going on. Okay, so for this first question, what do we mean by social inequality and how do we measure it? So we're going to start by kind of using an operational definition of social inequality as a system of power and domination which determines people's access to resources like housing, healthcare, education, and employment. Right. So, in that definition, we're kind of concerned with this question of resources, the kind of access to resources that people have. Certainly with housing, we see, when people, we see thousands of people just in San Francisco alone who are without access to housing. Certainly the healthcare system in the United States in particular is one in which, wealth and income and job status determines one's access to healthcare in a way that, isn't true in a place like Canada or in Britain, where they have, national healthcare systems. In the United States, you still have millions of people that don't have health insurance, meaning that if they, need, an emergency, it can, like bankrupt them. And there are, millions of people that have huge like medical debts. And so we know that access to healthcare is something that is definitely determined by, income and wealth and power. Education as a resource, we look at the huge disparities across the country in the quality of public schools, in the access that people have, again, towards education, which has become such a crucial, means of opportunity or, lack of opportunity for people to go up or down the class ladder. And so all of these factors are, what we would consider like resources that are at play and are, like literally like life and death kinds of issues for people, these access to resources. Now, in terms of measuring this social inequality, we're going to make an important distinction here that, is made in economics and in the social sciences and, more broadly. And that's a distinction between income and wealth. Okay, so income is basically just like the amount of money that a person is taking home, that's going into their bank account or whatever, or under their mattress or however, they're getting that income over, a month or a year or a week, over a specific period of time. And so for most people, that main source of income is their job. It's their salary or their wage or the tips that they get, or for, you know, many other people, though, there are, you know, there's like Social Security, or what we would call like transfer payments, you know, various forms of like public assistance or public aid that may contribute to people's income. Or, you know, if you know, you have like investment income or something like that. But for most people, like their main form of income is like their job. And that's, you know, just how it is for probably 80% of the population or something like that. Wealth, on the other hand, is a category of ownership. And it's a matter of what you own or what one owns. And so that would be like the value of your home, your automobile, if you have valuable things like, you know, art, or you know, valuable collectibles, or you know, I suppose like cryptocurrency or something like that. And also for, you know, for like the super wealthy, the super rich, the value of their business equity, you know, their stocks, the shares that they own in companies, or, you know, businesses that they might just own outright. People's, you know, retirement account, or their savings, their investments, all of these are come into play when we talk about wealth. So income is kind of like take home pay, or take home, you know, just how much money is coming into your life at a given point, a given amount of time. Wealth is the category of ownership. And so wealth, we're going to see, is especially important because that's the thing. Wealth is the thing that is transferred from generation to generation. And wealth is the thing that tends to really grow over time. The value of assets, like if you think about like how much more housing is worth today in California as opposed to like 50 years ago, housing, the wealth tends to appreciate, and it tends to be something that's then passed down from generation to generation. Families pass down that wealth, that home, to their you know, their next of kin. And so wealth becomes a really important factor in terms of inequality. And it also becomes a really important factor when it comes to looking at like how class inequalities and racial inequalities intersect. Because, for example, because of the long history of discrimination in the housing market, Black folks have a much less housing wealth to pass down to, you know, to their children in comparison to white families who had more access to the housing market, especially in a place like California, where, you know, you could buy a house for, you know, $100,000 or something that is totally unthinkable now. And the value of their houses has appreciated, you know, exponentially. It's, you know, skyrocketed, and then they can pass that value, that wealth, onto the next generation. They can take a loan based on the value of their house. They can, you know, send their kids to college with, you know, the appreciation of the value of their house. So one of the readings we'll call the racial wealth gap is especially important in American society in terms of this question of reproduction, of how these inequalities continue to persist and be reproduced over time. Now, one important thing to note here with regard to the distribution of income and the distribution of wealth is that the distribution of wealth is much more inequitable in the United States, wealth is much more unequal than the distribution of income. So we look at this, these two pie charts kind of tell us the story, which is basically that like the richest, 20% of the country, the richest, what we'll call a quintile, takes home about 48% of the income, almost half, but they take home like 83% or own 83% of the total wealth in the country. Whereas the poorest 60%, so like the majority of Americans, the poorest majority, I guess you could say, the 60%, own less than 5% of the wealth. Whereas they take home, I guess maybe about 30% of the total income. So the distribution of income is certainly skewed and unequal, but the distribution of wealth is much more unequal. And like I said, that has huge implications for this question of reproduction, of how the wealthy are able to pass down their wealth to the next generation, to use their wealth for political power. As we're increasingly seeing the way that the wealthy dominate politics. That has been the case for a long time, but it's become more extreme. So this has all of these major implications, this question of the distribution of wealth. When we look at like, what is this wealth based on? For most Americans, the most valuable source of wealth is their home. In this chart, that's represented by the green. So if you look at, this chart basically divides America into, different groups based on, from poorest to richest. So at the poorest, 25%, you see that most likely those people are not likely to own homes. So maybe their most valuable asset is their car or their savings account, or just the things that they own. Whereas the next group over, the 25 to 50%, their most valuable thing they have is basically their home equity. That's the green. And that's also the case for the 50 to 75%. So, people who are like what we would, I guess, call middle class or a little bit upper middle class. Again, it's the green there that's the most valuable thing that they own. And then they own a little bit of purple, which is the financial wealth, and maybe a little bit of red, which would be like business equity. And business equity is probably like stocks, most likely, like, you own a share in a company. That's what we would call business equity. And then the blue is their retirement accounts, right? Their pensions and 401ks and so forth. And still, even as you get into the top, 75 to 90, this is pretty much still the case. The green is the biggest thing that they own there, their home equity. And the retirement accounts is like a, kind of close second. But then as you get into like the top 10% and then into the top 1%, you see that more and more, like the thing that those people own, the biggest part of their, portfolio or whatever, is business equity and net financial wealth. So these are, like financial instruments and, all these, kind of pretty complicated and like intentionally complicated forms of financial ownership that are, connected to Wall Street and to the other financial markets around the world. and also, their business equity. And that stuff dwarfs the amount of wealth that they own in other, say their retirement accounts or even their homes. I mean, when we're talking about the top 1%, those are probably people that probably own, 5 or 6 homes or something like that. But that doesn't even like get on the radar in terms of their total overall portfolio of what they own. So for that, basically, the richer they are, the more it is that their wealth tends to be rooted in business equity and net financial wealth. Now, we're going to be looking at like the trends over time in the next question. But here, we can kind of start to take on that question insofar as like the overall trend that we've seen and that we're going to see throughout the semester is the rich basically taking a bigger and bigger slice of the overall wealth pie since, like the 1970s and 1980s. We see here in this chart, like the top 1% represented by the blue line has basically, been taking like, maybe they took a little bit smaller slice between, in the late 90s. But since about 2001, they've done nothing but increase their proportion of the wealth so that, today the 1% owns between like 35 and 40% of all the total wealth. Whereas, in 1989, they owned 30%. And like in the 1970s, it was more like 20%. And again, this has huge implications for a lot of things. One of which is like their dominance over the political system. So the political system is more and more skewed towards the interests of the 1%, because those are the folks that have the billions of dollars that can fund, political campaigns and, lobbying, and they have the kind of wealth and power to make sure that their interests are catered to, despite the fact that, they are not even close to a majority, that they represent a small percentage of the population in what is supposedly a democracy, but is increasingly kind of a plutocracy that is, run and organized for the benefit of a small but very wealthy and powerful minority. And we see conversely that the bottom 90% of the population has seen basically a steady decline in their ownership of wealth. So, whereas in 1989, the bottom 90% owned maybe like a third of the total, total wealth. Now it's less than a fourth. So there has been this, basically this trend towards the super rich getting even richer, and everybody else, not just the poor, but everybody else getting fighting over a smaller pile of crumbs. Taking home a smaller part. Even the next 9%, the orange line in this graph, we see that they, although they did steadily increase their slice of how much wealth they were taking, they too have kind of declined. It really has just become about the 1%. You may remember in the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, 2012, their main slogan was like, "We are the 99%," right? And what that did was, kind of highlight how there was just this growing gap between the 1% and everybody else. And that gap has only become more extreme in the 10 years since Occupy Wall Street. Now, conversely, we're also going to be, looking at, we've been talking about wealth, and we're also going to be looking at, the questions of poverty. And we're going to be looking sort of up and down all the ladders of all the rungs of the class system. But the question of poverty is also, has to start with like, how do we define and measure what we mean by poverty? And this is by no means like an objective or easy question to answer. The United States government has a measure of poverty that it's basically used since like the 1960s. And it's based on like the price of food. And it's based on like a food budget for a family. And so the poverty rate kind of like what they call the poverty line, like where, how much money do you have to be to make to be considered not poor versus how much money, do you have to make to be considered poor, is generally around like $25,000 a year for a family of four. So the poverty line kind of depends on how many people are in the family, and then like what region of what part of the country you're in. So the poverty line in California is a little higher. It's like, I think maybe in like 34,000 or something for a family of four. But this is a lot of people think that this measure of poverty is actually seriously undercounting poverty, that it underrepresents it because it ties the poverty line is tied to the food budget, to questions of food. And what has happened since like the 1960s and 1970s is that the cost of other necessities like housing, healthcare, childcare, those costs have shot up, have skyrocketed at a much higher rate than the price of food. And so there are more folks that are kind of going, without these basic resources, who are not able to afford these basic resources of like housing and healthcare and things like that. And so the measure of poverty should probably be, it's kind of a political question, a kind of a political debate. The government, has a kind of an interest in undercounting and underrepresenting the number of poor people in the country. And so a lot of sociologists and social scientists who measure this sort of thing for a living say that this poverty line is just too low. That, and it's too low because we have this old definition of poverty that's tied to the price of food, just to the price of food. And if a more comprehensive definition would also connect it to the price of housing and the price of healthcare and those kinds of costs for basic necessities. But if we did that, we'd have millions of more people who are considered poor in this country, who are not currently considered poor. Even with all that said, in the last census, there was approximately 37 million people in America, about 11% of the total population that was officially defined as poor based on their income or lack of income. And that number has generally, in the last like several decades, has generally hovered around like between 11 and 15% of the population that's considered poor in America. It actually used to be higher before the 1960s for reasons that we'll talk about. So that, the percentage of Americans in poverty since about the 1980s has kind of like fluctuated between 11 and 15%. Now, the rate of child poverty is higher than that, as we'll see. The poverty rate for children under age 18 is about 20%, meaning that 1 in 5 kids born in America is born into poverty, which is an absolutely shameful statistic for a country that has more wealth than any other country around the world. And that number also has not been improved upon for decades. It's generally been about 20% since like the 1980s or 1970s. And there is different that the United States has made some significant improvements in curing elderly poverty. So we have many less older people in poverty than we used to, but we have not, the country has not made any progress really in alleviating child poverty. And that has everything to do with public policy. And we'll talk more about that in a couple of slides down the road. Over the past several decades, the fastest growing group of poor people has been female-headed households. So basically single women who are raising children and so with only one source of income. And some people have called this what they call the feminization of poverty. Social scientists have used this term to describe this confluence of factors whereby, women on the whole earn, lower incomes than men, are more likely to be in jobs that pay like poverty level wages, and are trying to raise children on their own, with just one source of income. That has been, since like the 1960s or 1970s, that number has been steadily on the rise as far as like the bulk of these of the 37 million people who live in poverty in the United States. Now, when we look at these things over time, the interesting thing and a somewhat encouraging thing, I would say, is that there was a time when America was able to make some progress in reducing the amount of poverty in the country. And that was during the 1960s. As you see in these two graphs, and especially in the lower graph with the red line, you see that like, in the late 1950s, the poverty rate was somewhere between like 20 and 25%. And by 1970, they had gotten it down to between 10 and 15%, where, like I said, it's kind of hovered ever since, between 10 and 15%. But there was like a 10-year period where there was real progress that was made. And these were the social programs that were known collectively as the War on Poverty in the 1960s. Mostly enacted by the administration of Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy. And they, were intended, just like it says, to create social programs and policies that would reduce the amount of people living in poverty. And they had great success in doing so. Now, what happened is basically like once conservatives started taking power, especially, after the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, they basically started saying, oh, the war on poverty hadn't worked, and it was having all these negative effects, and so they basically ended the war on poverty. And some would say, I would say, they shifted from the war on poverty to a war against the poor. Certainly in the Reagan administration in the 1980s, began that process. And so ever since then, the United States has not really made any progress in eliminating poverty. But it's interesting to note that there was this time where we did cut into the problem. We didn't solve it, but we cut into the problem significantly. And so it kind of goes to show, like, if it has been done in the past, it can be done again. Maybe not entirely eliminating the issue, but certainly, like, it's not true that, like, there's nothing that can be done. That whole, kind of saying, like, the poor will always be with us. Well, this chart kind of shows the lie to that commonsensical kind of thinking. And it shows that, like, actually public policies do have an effect. Now, with this chart, it kind of shows us this in a bit more stark relief. I want you to look at the difference between the red line and the green line. The red line is the poverty rate for people 65 and older, for elderly poverty. And it used to be that this was the biggest group of poor people in the countries. We had just like millions of like elderly poor people. And, like 35% of the elderly were living in poverty. And it was shameful. It was, a real kind of, embarrassing, I suppose, fact about the country. That we had all these people that, were dying in poverty. And so public policy basically was directed towards alleviating that. And the United States has made great progress, so that, now poor people are the least likely, or elderly people are the least likely to be poor. That red line has declined below the levels of child poverty and below the level of just adult poverty. And so elderly poverty is now, thanks to programs like Social Security and Medicare and, public policies that have been designed to take care of the elderly, have had a huge impact on reducing the poverty among people of 65 and older. Conversely, if you look at the rate of child poverty, again, we did make some progress on this during the 1960s with the war on poverty. But ever since then, there's been basically no progress that has been made, because there isn't an equivalent to like Social Security for children. There isn't a national commitment to eliminating or reducing child poverty in the same way that there has been for elderly poverty. And so as a consequence, we still have this very shamefully high rate of child poverty, in which, like, one out of every 5 kids that's born in America is born poor. And obviously they didn't deserve that. There's no, and so it's a kind of a depressing thing to think about on the one hand, but on the other hand, it does show that, like, public policies have an effect. Policies have worked. This is not inevitable. This is not just like some fact that we have to accept. We don't have to just like say, well, there's just like, nothing we can do about, the rate of child poverty. We have the example of what we've done in terms of elderly poverty as, a counter argument to that, to say, like, look at the progress that we've made in curing elderly poverty. Obviously, when we talk about poverty, I mean, the most visible and the most extreme manifestations that we see, and we certainly see a lot of it here in the Bay Area, is homelessness. And these charts basically suggest is you have like about 500,000 people who experience across the country homelessness every year. About 580,000 people. And that, includes 400,000 individuals and 171,000 people in families. So one of the things with homelessness, is that, like, the people who are most visibly homeless are the people we see on the streets, or living in tents under the freeway, or living in tents on the streets. But there's also a lot of homeless families that are not necessarily as visible to the non-homeless people. Because they're living in cars, or they're living in, other kinds of, forms of substandard kind of shelter. So, people's perceptions of homelessness and the reality of homelessness is not necessarily the same, because, what you see, there's sort of like what you see. And again, we see a lot of it in the Bay Area, but then there's also a lot of like hidden homelessness of, like, people who are, like a family, like living in their car and sleeping in the Walmart parking lot, or, living, in like the many trailers that we see around Lake Merced in San Francisco State. So this is, like I said, like the kind of the most extreme manifestation, and the most kind of visible manifestation of poverty that we see in the United States right now, and especially in California and the Bay Area. In San Francisco, on any given night, there's approximately 7,000 to 8,000 people who are unhoused in the city. And again, that, ranges from people sleeping in tents on the streets to people living, in their cars, or in trailers, or in places like that. Across the Bay Area, it's something like 35 to 37,000 people on any given night who are unhoused. Keep in mind that this is not because there's a lack of housing. It is not that simple. There are something like 40,000 vacant units in San Francisco. So there's actually a lot more vacant housing in the city than there are homeless people. And, it's kind of like if you walk around like the South of Market neighborhood or the financial district or like the Mission, you will see that there are like a lot of these like newly built apartments like are dark, like they're just not people, they're not people living in them. And maybe they've been bought as an investment property or somebody's second home or something like that, but the vacancy rate is actually higher than the homeless rate in San Francisco and in Oakland and, across the Bay Area. The problem isn't that we don't have enough housing. The problem is we don't have enough affordable housing. That housing has been is a commodity rather than, something that is designed to meet human needs. It is designed to be bought and sold and, as an investment property and as something that accumulates value over time. And so there really isn't like a lot of economic incentive to build affordable housing. They're not going to make as much profit building affordable housing. So the problem is not like that we don't have enough housing per se. It's that like there's this kind of mismatch of like distribution. It's not lack of supply. It's a question of distribution. And so, this is this kind of cruel reality that we see all over the Bay Area, where more and more people are being displaced and kicked out of their homes. And then like, you got all these other homes and apartments and condos that are just like sitting empty. And this is, again, across the state. California has become the leading state for homelessness in the United States. And this is, a real visible symptom of this larger crisis. So the second question that we've posed, we've kind of like defined our concepts, of wealth and inequality and, wealth versus income and poverty and homelessness. The second question, we look at is like, how have these dynamics of social inequality changed over time? And it started to kind of introduce some of this puzzle in the previous slides. But the idea is that, since like the late 1970s or early 1980s, inequality has been steadily increasing. Like we saw, like, the 1% are taking a bigger and bigger share of, the total wealth in the society. But this was not always the case. There is this period after World War II, the World War II ends in 1945. And from about 1945 until like the late 1970s, mid 1970s, maybe, there was a period of like 30 years of growing equality. That doesn't mean that like everybody was living like in a socialist, kind of like egalitarianism, but it does mean that like the trends were going the other way. The trends were going towards more equality. And we saw, in the previous slides, there was definitely a trend towards less poverty. The United States was making inroads, was making progress in terms of reducing poverty during these years. There was the growth of the so-called middle class, especially during the 1950s and 1960s. There was more of a kind of like shared prosperity. Now, it was deeply imperfect, especially with regard to like racial inequalities, right? So that like when we talk about the growth of the middle class in America, it's largely, not exclusively, but largely a growth of a white middle class. And that is because there were these government programs and subsidies and policies that were, that were biased and skewed towards, towards white people and towards workers who were in, occupations dominated by white people, and basically excluded people of color and people who were, in jobs like, farm workers or domestics, or, it discriminated against certain job occupations that were disproportionately staffed by people of color. And it, discriminated against communities, against neighborhoods that were disproportionately populated by people of color. So these policies during the 1950s and 60s, beginning like after World War II, they were, sort of like racially exclusive or racially discriminatory, but they did have the impact of building like more of a white middle class in America. And it, so again, there's like kind of a lesson that like, if it can be done, if it was done in the past, it can be done again in the present, and it can be done in a more inclusive way in the present, right? If we have proof that these policies can, broadly lift people into a condition of greater equality, then those policies can then be expanded and extended so that they are more inclusive along lines of race and gender. So during this period, like the 1%, was taking home a declining share of income and wealth. Like they still had their yachts and they still had their homes in the Hamptons and all that kind of thing. Like, you don't need to shed a tear for the 1% during the 50s and 60s, but they were taking home like a lot less of the total wealth than they are today. So in the film that you watch, Inequality for All, Robert Reich talks about this period between 1947 and 1977. Those are the years that he kind of demarcates it. He talks about this period as the Great Prosperity. And in this time, we had social policies that were characterized by much higher taxes on the wealthy, first and foremost. The tax rate on the 1% and the tax rate on, just like the rich was much higher than it is today. It's been declining since Reagan was elected in 1980. One of the first things that Reagan did was cut taxes for the wealthy. And everybody's, Trump cut taxes for the wealthy as well. We've had, at the same time that, during this period in the 40s and 50s and 60s, we were taxing the wealthy at a higher rate and using that tax money to pay for investments in higher education, in housing, and in highway construction. So again, a lot of this was kind of racially exclusive and racially discriminatory insofar as it created this kind of like suburban white middle class and like funneled a lot of money to the suburbs and to housing construction in the suburbs. but it was still a policy that did, grow this middle class and allowed people who were, workers or, working class people to send their kids to college, and for, those college graduates to have, more opportunity as white collar workers, as professional workers. So there was this growth of the middle class. There was this reduction in poverty. There was a growing kind of equality. And a lot of that has to do with public policy. And a lot of that public policy was based on the fact that there was strong union representation, that many more workers were represented by unions. That allowed workers to take home higher pay, to have more job security, that allowed them to live a higher standard of living. But it also meant that unions had more representation in politics. The unions were much more influential, especially with the Democratic Party. And so they were able to enact and push through these policies and this legislation that was more favorable towards working people. And that included these, investments in housing and highway construction and higher education that, were paid for by higher rates of taxation on the wealthy. So these gender and race inequalities certainly persisted. And that's, in part why you see the social movements of the 60s and 70s start to gain a lot of momentum and power. These were, people who were basically kind of left out of, what they called the Great Society during the 1960s, which was, really mostly kind of like great for like white men, and for people in the working class and middle class, but of a certain race and a certain gender, they were able to experience like upward mobility. But it does, as imperfect and as problematic as this period was and these policies were, again, they do give us a kind of glimmer of hope to show that like there are things that can be done to reduce poverty, to grow the middle class, to provide more equal opportunity for people, to tax the wealthy at a higher rate. It can be done because it has been done before. So when we look at this movie, the Inequality for All by Robert Reich, he will give us this kind of like, long-term kind of perspective in which like, what you look at here is a graph that he refers to at different points in the film, which shows like how much of the wealth the 1% were taking home. And during like the 1920s, it was a huge amount too. This the so-called Roaring 20s. It was kind of the end of what was called the Gilded Age, where you had these like the Rockefellers and these super wealthy families that were taking in a lot of wealth. And then there was the crash that followed right after that, in many ways as a result of that, as a result of the fact that there was so much inequality that working class people didn't have the income to purchase the things that were for sale in the economy, and so there's this big crash in 1929, and then a Great Depression which follows, and you can see that in this period in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, that the 1% is taking in a smaller and smaller part of the wealth. kind of peaks out down, in like the 1970s when it's like under 10%. So, things were for decades trending in this more equitable direction. And then starting, in the late 70s and especially like in 1980, again, like Ronald Reagan's election is a real turning point. Then you start to see the inequality begin to climb again through the 80s and 90s until you reach another peak in 2007. And what happens after 2007? Well, you have another crash, not as severe as the Great Depression of the 1930s, but a huge crash in the economy in 2008, 2009. Millions of people lost their homes. People lost, there was a real, people lost their jobs. People's lives were ruined. The only difference is that after 2007, which, this chart doesn't show you, the 1% have just continued to increase their share of the wealth, so that it hovers around today they're taking home it's somewhere like 25% of the top income share, which is what's represented in this graph, and like I said, somewhere between 35 and 40% of the total wealth. So Robert Reich will talk about this as like kind of almost looking like a suspension bridge, like this graph. And he will be, pointing our direction to like the dangers of 1928 and 2007, but also, asking about this period between like the 40s and the 70s where you see a real dip in the 1% income share. And asking like, what is it that America did differently during that period of time, and like, could we do that again in a more equitable kind of way? So this long-term trend in the distribution of wealth, it kind of shows us, a similar kind of thing. The light blue line is the amount of wealth owned by the top 0.1%. So not the 1%, but the richest, the richest 10% within the 1%. So we're talking here basically about billionaires. And that light blue line, again, like you see, starts to, was declining for a long time. Between like the late 1920s and the early 80s or late 70s, and then that light blue line of the super wealthy has increased dramatically since about 1980. And conversely, the amount of wealth owned by the bottom 90%, so like the vast majority of Americans, that steadily increased, that dark blue line, from 1930 to about the middle of the 80s or the early 1980s. And since then, it's been in a steady free-for-all. So that basically like this top 0.1% owns almost as much as the bottom 90%. It may be now that they actually own more, since this graph seems to end at 2012. So it's been quite a remarkable reversal. Conversely, during the Great Prosperity, we see that, this chart divides the population into 5 different groups, like from the poorest 20% to the richest 20%, and then the top 1%. And it shows you two very different stories, that like during this period demarcates it, between 1947 and 1979, the green bar. You see that like the biggest income gains were among the poorest 20% of the population. They were the ones who had the biggest increases in this period in their income between the late 40s and late 70s. So like low wage workers. This was a period when the minimum wage was increasing at a faster rate, for inflation. Whereas, since then, the value of the minimum wage, when adjusted for inflation, has declined or stagnated. So the poorest 20% were the ones doing, seeing the biggest increases to their income, but it was, basically broadly shared during this period that's represented by the green bars. Everybody got a little bit more in their paycheck during this period of time. The top 1% had the smallest. They were only at 7.17% increase, whereas the poorest 20% were at 9.83%. In the red bar, we see the situation is totally reversed. The red bars represent 1979 through 2004. And we see in that period that the only people who have really experienced income growth has been the top 1%. And everybody has experienced like a smaller increase in their income in this period. So, and that's something that, has only become more extreme since the 2000s. So basically, like the poorer you are, the least that your income has increased, right? So people, like the value of minimum wage jobs has declined, and also, people's transfer payments, welfare and Social Security and stuff like that have also been cut. So, kind of the poorer you are, the worse it's been since, like 1979. This chart looks at like sort of workers' compensation for productivity. And here again, we see a tale of two different periods in history, where the 1970s is kind of the transitional moment. In the period between 1948 and 1973, we basically see that it was the economy, the productivity of the economy overall was growing, right? So we were just producing more outputs, more goods and services, and workers' wages increased at the same rate as productivity. So we basically can think of it as like we have an increasingly productive economy, and workers are being paid in fairly for the increase in their in the economic productivity. So hourly compensation increased by like 90%, 91%, and productivity increased at 96%. So they basically match, right? So workers are basically being paid fairly for an increase in productivity. Wages are going up as productivity is going up. And then you notice that the two lines totally diverge beginning in the 1970s, like 1973. Hourly compensation flattens. So wages are not going up anymore. They're basically just stagnating and barely keeping pace with inflation. Whereas productivity is continuing to rise. So the economy is more productive, but now workers aren't seeing that productivity reflected in bigger paychecks. So who's profiting from this increasing productivity with stagnant wages? And I think we know the answer to that now is, it's this wealthy 1%, and particularly these wealthy people who own the businesses and that own, the ownership class, right? The people who are wealthy because of their ownership of, of business equity, of stocks, of businesses that are profiting from an economy that is more productive, where workers are being paid the same low wage that they've been paid since the 70s. So the bosses, the ownership class, the capitalist class, is the one that really benefited from this situation. And so the question of what happened? Why were workers, during the 50s and 60s, why were they able to get higher wages that were commensurate with the increases in productivity? But then after the 70s, they're no longer able to do that. And the main answer for that, as we're going to see, is the decline in unions and union power. And there's a lot of factors behind that, not least of which is the fact that there was this kind of political war against unions that starts to be fought in the 70s, and then Ronald Reagan really takes up when he comes into office. And also, with globalization and outsourcing, it means that a lot of union jobs are eliminated or, outsourced to Mexico, or, factories are closed, manufacturing jobs are eliminated. And there's economic conversion to more of a service-based economy where there are no unions, or unions have been historically pretty weak. So for all of these reasons, starting in the 70s and then accelerating into the 80s and 90s, you have a society where capital just has a lot more power relative to labor. Labor's fortunes are in decline, and there's not the same kind of union power after the 1970s and 80s that would allow workers to get a bigger slice of this pie that's coming from an increasingly productive economy. Now, how have things gone in COVID? Well, as you may guess, things have also become more extreme. They have certainly not become more equitable. On the one hand, billionaires' wealth has skyrocketed at a rate that we have never seen before. All of the biggest, wealthiest billionaires in the country, starting with Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, have seen their wealth just multiply in the period of, just in the couple of years that we've been in the COVID pandemic. And that's mainly been by, squeezing workers and consumers. So there's been this huge redistribution of wealth towards the already wealthy. Also, what we've seen, is that higher income individuals have been more likely to work from home, and that has kind of insulated more high income people from the worst effects of COVID. Whereas low wage workers have been more likely to lose their job, and also less able to work from home. So they've been more exposed to COVID, and their families have been more exposed to COVID. So that's a reason why, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, we saw much higher death rates and hospitalization rates among people of color and among working class people in general during the early months of the pandemic is because people were not as able to like stay and work at home, and so they were more kind of exposed to the effects of the disease, and therefore more likely to bring it back to their home and to their communities. Likewise, non-union workers have been more likely to lose their jobs compared to workers that were represented by a union, especially, in service sector kinds of employment. And we've seen, as I said, these higher death and hospitalization rates among people of color, and people of color being less likely to, be able to work at home. This statistic kind of makes me want to throw up a little bit. These statistics, the richest 15 billionaires between March 2020 and October 2021, so that's 19 months, were able to increase their wealth by a total of $732 billion. That being an average increase of 86%. In other words, they almost doubled their total wealth in a period of a year and a half, where there was just this mass suffering going on. The most extreme of these that we see is Elon Musk, increased his wealth by $184 billion. So that's like $10 billion a month that this man has been increasing his wealth. That's a 751% increase during these 19 months. He's the most extreme, but if you look at these numbers, you see that they all made out. Mark Zuckerberg doubled his wealth from 54 billion before the pandemic to 117 billion in October 2021. The Walton family, that owns Walmart, Phil Knight from Nike, Bill Gates, all of these people, you saw these huge increases in their wealth during this period of time. So, the pandemic has certainly been good for the billionaires. And then on the other side of things, as I was mentioning, like people who are in the lowest paying jobs, the people with the lowest incomes have been the ones who have been less likely or less able to work from home, to shelter in place, and also the ones that are most likely to have lost their jobs altogether. So people, who've been teleworking have been able to kind of insulate themselves from these mental and physical hardships that the pandemic has imposed. And likewise with job losses, basically, like, the lower your income, the more likely it was that you lost your job during COVID. That's basically what this chart is saying. The highest job loss rate in the first few months of the pandemic, when millions of people lost their jobs and were thrown into really severe hardship. It's one of these things where just like the lower your income and the worse your job was, the more likely you were to lose it. So, the pandemic has done, in the sense, it's unlike the Great Depression. The pandemic has actually kind of widened these inequalities. The rich have gotten astronomically richer, and the most oppressed and vulnerable populations have been the ones that have been hardest hit. So even though it's a kind of like a natural disaster in the sense of it being a virus, it's very much like a social disaster in terms of its consequences. Okay, so the next lectures will pick up the questions, starting with like the factors of economic and political changes, and the questions of globalization, and the relation between social inequality in America and social inequality internationally. And that's where we'll pick up. And I'm going to stop the share, and that'll be good for today. Thank you.